No one questioned the man who walked into courtroom 3 that morning. He moved like someone who belonged there, not confident, not nervous, just precise, as if every step had already been measured long before he arrived. The case had already drawn attention across the state. A high-profile financial betrayal, millions missing, a company collapsing overnight, investors demanding answers, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Hargrove, CEO, philanthropist, public figure. To the media, he was either a misunderstood genius or a calculated thief. To the jury, he was simply the defendant. But to the man who had just taken a seat in the back row, Daniel Hargrove was something else entirely. He was unfinished business. The judge entered. The courtroom rose. The sound of chairs scraping the floor blended into a quiet tension that felt almost physical. No one noticed the observer. No one noticed that he wasn't listed on the attendance sheet. No one noticed that the name he signed at the entrance desk didn't exist in any public database. And yet, by the end of the trial, his presence would change everything. 3 years earlier, Daniel Hargrove had been untouchable. His company, Aurelian Systems, grew faster than anyone predicted. Investors praised his vision. Employees described him as demanding but brilliant. He rarely gave interviews. He never explained his past. And people stopped asking. Success erases curiosity, or at least it buries it. The first crack appeared quietly. An internal audit flagged discrepancies, small at first, almost invisible among millions of transactions. A transfer routed through an overseas subsidiary. Then another. Then a series of payments to a consulting firm that no employee recognized. The firm existed only on paper. Within 2 weeks, the board demanded answers. Within 2 months, federal investigators opened a case. And within 6 months, Daniel Hargrove stood alone at a press conference, denying everything. "I built this company with integrity," he said calmly, "and I will prove that." People believed him. At first. Back in courtroom 3, the prosecution began outlining their narrative. They spoke with certainty. They described a pattern of deception, a secret network of accounts, a CEO who had engineered his own escape route. Each detail sounded complete. Each accusation felt final. The jury listened. The defense attorney remained still. Daniel himself showed almost no reaction, only the faint tightening of his jaw when certain documents appeared on the screen. In the back row, the observer leaned forward slightly, not reacting, just watching, as if he had already seen this trial before. The prosecution called their first witness, a former financial analyst from Aurelian Systems. She spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded rehearsed but sincere. She described the moment she discovered irregularities, the confusion, the fear of reporting it, the late nights rechecking numbers, hoping she had made a mistake. "I trusted him," she said, her voice steady. A pause. "I think we all did." That sentence hung in the room longer than expected. Trust. It wasn't just about money. It was about belief. The observer watched the jury's faces carefully. He noticed who nodded, who frowned, who avoided eye contact. He noticed everything. Outside the courtroom, reporters debated. Some argued the evidence was overwhelming. Others insisted the case felt too convenient. Online forums exploded with speculation. Why would a man already wealthy risk everything? Why were certain transactions routed through companies that disappeared immediately after? And why did Daniel Hargrove refuse to discuss his early career? Questions multiplied faster than answers. Inside, the trial continued. The defense finally stood. Instead of immediately arguing against the accusations, they asked a simple question. What if the story you've heard is incomplete? The courtroom shifted. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Incomplete stories, the attorney continued, create convenient villains. He paused. But convenience is not truth. The observer's expression changed for the first time, a faint recognition, as if he had been waiting for those exact words. Documents appeared on screen, emails, contracts, timeline inconsistencies. The defense didn't deny the missing money. They reframed it. They suggested manipulation. They implied someone else had constructed a narrative designed to point in only one direction. The prosecution objected repeatedly. The judge allowed limited continuation. Tension built slowly, like pressure behind glass. The observer's hands rested calmly on his knees. He knew what was coming, but no one else did. Halfway through the session, a small detail slipped into the testimony. A name, not central to the case, not emphasized, almost overlooked. Yet when it appeared, Daniel Hargrove finally reacted. Just a flicker, a shift in posture. The observer noticed immediately. He smiled for the first time, because the trial had just entered dangerous territory. The court adjourned for lunch. Jurors left quietly, lawyers whispered urgently, reporters rushed outside to deliver updates. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. As he stood, his eyes moved briefly toward the back row, toward the observer. Their gazes met. Recognition flashed between them. Not surprise, not fear. Something older, something unresolved. Then Daniel looked away and walked out. The observer waited until the room emptied completely. He stood slowly, walked toward the exit, stopped near the witness stand, and touched the edge of the wood as if confirming something real. A memory, or a decision. No one heard him speak, but he did, quietly. Not yet. Outside, clouds gathered over the courthouse. Rain threatened, but never fell. The kind of weather that feels suspended between choices, just like the trial itself, because the truth was not what either side believed. And before the week ended, the court would learn that the defendant's greatest secret wasn't the missing money. It was his real identity. And the observer was the only person who knew it. The second day of the trial began with rain, not heavy enough to disrupt the city, but steady enough to change its rhythm. Umbrellas opened like silent signals across the courthouse steps. Reporters gathered early, sensing that something had shifted during the first session. Inside, courtroom 3 felt different. The air carried expectation, the subtle awareness that the story presented so far was incomplete. Daniel Hargrove entered without looking at anyone. He took his seat with the same controlled precision, hands folded, expression calm but distant. If he felt pressure, it did not show. The observer arrived moments later. Same seat, same stillness. Only one difference. Today, he watched Daniel more closely than the proceedings themselves, as if measuring time, as if waiting for a particular moment that only he could recognize. The prosecution opened the day aggressively. They presented financial timelines, transaction trails, and expert testimony designed to eliminate doubt. Every detail pointed toward intentional deception. Every chart implied a deliberate pattern. And yet something felt rehearsed, not false, but too perfect. The defense allowed the narrative to unfold without interruption. They watched, they listened, they waited. Because patience in court can be more dangerous than argument. Mid-morning, the prosecution introduced a new witness, a former partner of Daniel Hargrove from his early career. The room grew quieter. Until now, Daniel's past had remained vague, a collection of achievements without origin. This was the first person to speak about who he had been before success. The witness adjusted his tie nervously. He avoided looking directly at Daniel. "We worked together in consulting," he began. "Small projects at first, Mostly restructuring failing companies. The prosecutor guided him carefully. Did you observe anything unusual about Mr. Hargrove's methods? A pause. Yes. The word landed softly but heavily. He didn't just fix companies, he changed them completely. Leadership, culture, even identity. It was like watching someone rewrite reality. Murmurs moved through the audience. The prosecutor leaned forward. Would you describe him as manipulative? The defense objected. Sustained. But the seed had already been planted. Manipulative. The word lingered in the room long after it was spoken. The observer watched the jury again. Some leaned toward the prosecution's narrative. Others seemed uncertain. Uncertainty was fertile ground, and someone was cultivating it. The defense cross-examined slowly. Mr. Hargrove transformed failing companies, the attorney said calmly. Did those companies survive afterward? Yes. Did employees keep their jobs? Most of them, yes. So his methods, whatever you call them, produced results. The witness hesitated. Yes, the defense nodded. No further questions? Simple, strategic, incomplete. During a brief recess, whispers filled the hallway. Reporters speculated about Daniel's early career. Online discussions intensified. Old photographs surfaced. Grainy images from conferences, blurred appearances at industry events, a man always present but rarely centered. It was as if Daniel had existed near history without ever belonging fully to it. Back inside, the prosecution introduced evidence from a defunct consulting firm connected to the missing funds. A name appeared again, the same name from yesterday's overlooked detail. This time, the defense did not object. They watched. Daniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. And in the back row, the observer leaned forward, because this was the moment he had been waiting for. The prosecutor described the firm as a shell company, created months before the financial discrepancies began, dissolved immediately afterward, all documents traced back to a single registered director. A person no one had located, a person who did not appear in any public record. The courtroom felt colder. This individual, the prosecutor continued, operated under multiple identities, each connected to transactions benefiting Mr. Hargrove. A photograph appeared on screen. Blurry, partial, unclear. The jury strained to see. Daniel looked down, and for the first time, something close to emotion crossed his face. Not guilt, not fear, recognition. The defense stood. We request clarification regarding authentication of this identity. The judge allowed limited questioning. As the exchange continued, the observer's gaze shifted from the screen back to Daniel. The tension between them felt invisible, yet undeniable, because the identity displayed on that screen was neither entirely real nor entirely false, and both men knew why. Afternoon light filtered through the courtroom windows, turning the air golden and heavy. Fatigue settled in, but the narrative accelerated. The prosecution argued that Daniel had created a network of false identities to move funds undetected. The defense suggested that someone else had engineered those identities to frame him. The jury faced two competing realities, both plausible, neither complete. Late in the day, the judge allowed one final witness, a digital forensics expert. He explained how identity fabrication had evolved over the past decade, how online records could be constructed, altered, erased, how someone with enough knowledge could become invisible or create ghosts. The expert paused. In this case, he said carefully, we found something unusual. The room leaned forward collectively. The identity linked to the transactions shows signs of layered authorship. The prosecutor frowned. Explain. It appears multiple individuals contributed to its creation over time. Silence followed, because that meant the narrative was no longer simple, no longer singular. Someone had built the identity, and someone else had continued it. The observer exhaled slowly. The trial had crossed a threshold. Truth was no longer stable. As the session ended, Daniel gathered his documents slowly. Again, his eyes moved toward the back row. This time, he held the gaze longer. A silent exchange passed between them. Not accusation, not apology, recognition of shared history. Outside, rain finally stopped. Clouds parted slightly, revealing a sky caught between storm and clarity. Because the real story was not about missing money. It was about a past that had been deliberately erased, and the closer the court moved toward uncovering it, the more dangerous the truth would become. By the third day, the courtroom had stopped feeling like a place of law. It felt like a stage where two different versions of reality were being carefully constructed and slowly dismantled. The media coverage intensified overnight. Headlines shifted from financial fraud to something far more compelling. Who was Daniel Hargrove before he became Daniel Hargrove? The question spread faster than any legal argument, because people are drawn not to numbers, but to identity. And identity, once questioned, never remains stable. Daniel entered the courtroom earlier than usual. He sat alone, reviewing documents that he did not appear to be reading. His attention drifted toward the empty seats, toward the doors, toward something unseen. He knew the trial had crossed a point of no return. The observer arrived last. He paused at the entrance longer than before, scanning the room slowly. Not searching, confirming. Then he sat and waited. The defense began the morning unexpectedly. Instead of responding directly to the prosecution's evidence, they introduced a timeline, not of financial transactions, but of Daniel's life. Sparse, incomplete, years missing, career transitions that appeared too sudden, records that existed but felt edited. The attorney spoke calmly. You have been presented with a narrative suggesting a man who created false identities to hide money. Today, we ask a different question. He paused. What if the identity itself was never entirely real to begin with? The words landed with controlled precision. The prosecutor objected immediately. Overruled. The judge allowed continuation, because even the court could feel the gravitational pull of the question. A former investigative journalist took the stand. She had spent years researching corporate fraud. Her testimony shifted the atmosphere. Daniel Hargrove appeared in public records approximately 12 years ago, she explained. Before that, there are fragments, partial education records, scattered employment history, but nothing continuous. She adjusted her glasses. It's as if someone assembled a life from separate pieces. The prosecutor attempted to discredit her conclusions, but doubt had already entered the room, and doubt changes how every piece of evidence is seen. The observer watched Daniel closely, not for reactions, but for restraint, because restraint reveals more than emotion. The defense introduced an archive of photographs, industry conferences, private meetings, group events where Daniel appeared briefly, always on the edge of the frame. Different cities, different years, same expression. Detached, observing rather than participating. The attorney spoke quietly. People assumed they knew who he was because he behaved like someone familiar. But familiarity can be manufactured. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The jury leaned forward. Human beings crave origin stories, and this one was beginning to fracture. Then the defense did something unexpected. They called a witness without revealing his identity beforehand. The courtroom doors opened slowly. Footsteps echoed, and the observer stood. For a moment, no one reacted, because no one expected the quiet man from the back row to move. He walked forward with measured calm. Every eye followed him. Daniel's posture changed instantly, not fear, recognition, and something deeper, resignation. The observer took the stand. He gave a name, a real name, verified within seconds by court staff. But the weight of his presence came not from who he claimed to be, but from how he looked at Daniel, like someone who knew the truth long before the trial began. The defense approached carefully. "Do you recognize the defendant?" "Yes." "How long have you known him?" A pause. "Longer than anyone in this room." The prosecutor stiffened. The jury's attention sharpened. And Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if accepting that the moment he had avoided for years had finally arrived. The questioning began slowly. The witness described a past partnership, not business, but survival. Two young men working in environments where identity was fluid, where reinvention was necessary. "Some people build companies," the witness said quietly. "Others build themselves." The room listened without moving. The defense allowed silence to stretch. Silence can be more persuasive than explanation. "Did Daniel Hargrove always use that name?" The question shifted the air. "No," the word echoed. The prosecutor objected again, denied. Because the trial had transformed, this was no longer about missing money. It was about a man who might not be who anyone believed. The witness described a moment years earlier. A choice, a disappearance, a reinvention. He did not accuse. He did not defend. He simply revealed fragments. Enough to destabilize certainty. Not enough to resolve it. The perfect balance between clarity and mystery. The prosecution cross-examined aggressively. They implied fabrication, bias, personal motive. The witness remained calm, because truth, when spoken without emotion, becomes harder to attack. Late afternoon light faded through the windows as the courtroom absorbed the implications. If Daniel had changed identities once, could he have done it again? Was he the architect of deception? Or someone who had escaped a past too dangerous to reveal? The narrative split into two opposing interpretations, and both felt equally real. As the judge called for adjournment, tension remained suspended in the air. Daniel stood slowly. For the first time since the trial began, he looked directly at the witness. Their gaze held. Years of unspoken history passed silently between them. Not anger, not forgiveness. Recognition of shared secrets. Outside, reporters waited like predators sensing vulnerability. Questions flew, speculation exploded. The story had shifted from financial crime to identity mystery. And once identity becomes uncertain, every action becomes suspicious. That night, the city argued. Online debates divided into sides. Some believed Daniel was a master manipulator hiding behind reinvention. Others believed he was the victim of a past engineered by someone else. The truth remained hidden between narratives, exactly where it was safest. Because the real fracture had only begun. And when the court reconvened, the most dangerous question would finally be asked. Not who Daniel Hargrove was, but who had created him. By the fourth day, the courtroom no longer belonged to the lawyers. It belonged to the story. People arrived early not for legal clarity, but for revelation. The case had transformed into something larger than accusation or defense. It had become a search for authorship, not of a crime, but of a life. Because once identity is questioned, responsibility becomes uncertain. And uncertainty reshapes everything. Daniel Hargrove entered quietly, but the atmosphere shifted the moment he appeared. Cameras flashed outside. Inside, whispers followed him like echoes. He no longer looked like a defendant alone. He looked like a puzzle everyone believed they were close to solving. The witness from yesterday sat near the front now, no longer hidden in the back row. his presence altered the balance of the room. Two men connected by a history only partially revealed. Two narratives competing silently for truth. The defense began without preamble. They projected a series of documents onto the screen. Contracts, identity registrations, business filings. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. But when aligned chronologically, patterns emerged. Names changing, locations shifting. Entities forming and dissolving with unusual precision. The attorney spoke softly. Identity can be forged through deception, but it can also be constructed through necessity. The prosecution objected to the philosophical tone, overruled, because philosophy had become unavoidable. A forensic historian took the stand. Her expertise lay not in crime, but in tracing the evolution of personal identity across legal systems. She described how individuals in unstable environments often adopted new identities for survival. Legal loopholes, administrative oversights, systems designed for order that unintentionally allowed reinvention. In rare cases, she explained, multiple individuals collaborate in creating a single identity framework. The room grew still. "Why would that happen?" the defense asked. She paused. To erase someone from danger, or to create someone capable of entering spaces the original person could not. The jury exchanged glances. A new interpretation formed. Not fraud, transformation. The prosecution countered with intensity. They argued that the defense was romanticizing manipulation, that creating identities was itself evidence of deceit. They presented financial flows again, grounding the trial back in measurable facts. Money moved, accounts vanished, someone benefited, facts demanded accountability. The courtroom shifted between emotional narrative and cold data, unable to settle on either. Daniel remained silent, but his silence felt deliberate, as if every word spoken around him was part of a larger design he had anticipated long ago. Midday, the defense called an unexpected witness, a former government analyst specializing in identity fraud networks. He reviewed the layered identity discussed earlier. Most fabricated identities show inconsistencies, he explained. Small errors, repetition patterns, digital fingerprints. He paused, studying the screen. This one does not. The prosecutor leaned forward. What does that imply? It implies multiple creators working over extended periods, each correcting the previous layer. Silence deepened. Meaning? It evolved, like a living system. The words changed the air. Identity was no longer a mask. It was architecture. Witness from earlier watched carefully, his expression unreadable, because he understood something the rest of the room did not. Architecture requires an architect. The defense approached slowly. Can you determine who began constructing this identity? The analyst hesitated. Not conclusively, but you have a theory. A long pause. Yes. The courtroom leaned closer. The initial framework predates Daniel Hargrove's first documented appearance by several years. The implications settled heavily. Someone else had started it. The prosecution objected fiercely. Speculation, inference, unverified conclusions. The judge allowed limited continuation because the question had already entered the room. And once a question exists, it cannot be erased. Afternoon shadows lengthened across the courtroom. Fatigue mixed with anticipation. The defense made their final move of the day. They presented a sequence of communications recovered from an encrypted archive, messages between unidentified parties discussing preparation, integration, and handover. No explicit names, only fragments. But one phrase repeated, "The architect decides when the identity becomes real." The jury felt the shift immediately. The narrative fractured again. Daniel might not have created himself. Someone might have designed him. The prosecution attempted to restore clarity. They argued that even if another person existed, Daniel still controlled the financial decisions. Intent remained central. Responsibility could not be transferred, but doubt had already rooted itself deeply, and doubt changes perception more effectively than certainty. As the session ended, tension remained unresolved. Daniel gathered his papers slowly. He did not look toward the witness this time. Instead, he stared ahead, as if calculating distances no one else could see. Outside, reporters debated two emerging camps. One believed Daniel was the mastermind behind everything. The other believed he was the final piece in a much larger plan. Both interpretations generated fierce argument. An argument fuels attention. That night, a single question dominated every discussion. If Daniel Hargrove was not the architect, who was? And why had that person remained hidden until now? Because the final day would not reveal a simple truth. It would expose a choice made long ago, a decision that transformed two lives forever. And when that choice surfaced, the courtroom would no longer ask whether Daniel was guilty. It would ask whether he had ever been free. The final day arrived without ceremony, no sudden drama, no visible shift in the sky, just the quiet certainty that something irreversible was about to surface. Courtroom 3 filled earlier than ever before. Journalists leaned forward in their seats. Observers spoke in hushed tones. Even those who had attended only out of curiosity now felt pulled into something deeper, a story no longer confined to legal arguments. Because the trial had stopped being about money, it had become a confrontation with identity itself. Daniel Hargrove entered last. He paused briefly near the doorway, scanning the room as though memorizing it, not with fear, with acceptance. He took his seat slowly. The witness, the man who had stepped forward from the back row, sat directly behind the defense table. Today, there was no distance between them, only history. The judge opened the session with measured authority. Final testimonies would be heard. Closing arguments would follow. A decision would eventually emerge. But everyone understood that the verdict itself was no longer the true center of attention. The truth was. The defense began. Their tone changed, less defensive, more revealing. They called their final witness. No announcement, no build-up, just a name spoken quietly into the record. And when the courtroom doors opened, something shifted instantly. The witness who had already testified, the observer, stood again. Gasps moved through the audience. The prosecution stiffened. Daniel did not react outwardly. But something behind his eyes moved, like a long-held breath finally released. The defense approached carefully. "You testified previously about your shared history with the defendant," the attorney said calmly. "Yes. Today we ask you to clarify one final point." Silence settled. "Did you create the identity known as Daniel Hargrove?" The question landed like a fracture through glass. The witness did not answer immediately. He looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded once. Permission, or perhaps inevitability. "Yes," the witness said quietly. The room held its breath. "I began it." The prosecutor rose instantly. Objection, speculation, irrelevance, overruled, because the moment had already reshaped the trial. The witness spoke without emotion. Years earlier, he explained, both men had existed in circumstances that made survival uncertain. Legal trouble, dangerous associations, a past where remaining visible meant remaining vulnerable. They needed escape. But escape required legitimacy, identity, structure, a future that could not be traced backward. "I built the framework," he said. Records, education history, early employment, all legally constructed, all designed to hold under scrutiny. The jury listened, stunned. "You're admitting to identity fraud?" the prosecutor demanded. "I'm admitting to creating possibility." The distinction lingered. The witness described how the identity evolved. At first, it was protection, then opportunity. Daniel stepped into the role gradually, transforming it into something real through action, work, success. "An identity begins as a story," the witness said softly, "but it becomes truth when lived long enough." The prosecution cross-examined with sharp intensity. They argued that creating an identity demonstrated deliberate deception, proof that Daniel could fabricate financial systems as well. But the witness remained calm. "You're assuming identity creation equals criminal intent," he said. "But people reinvent themselves every day. Most simply lack the tools to do it legally." The courtroom wrestled with the statement because it felt both unsettling and undeniable. The defense introduced their final piece of evidence, encrypted communications recovered from the archive mentioned earlier. This time, full context appeared. Messages revealing conflict between the two men, arguments about control, warnings ignored. One phrase repeated, "The identity belongs to the one who lives it." The jury absorbed the implication. The architect had built the framework, but Daniel had become the person within it. Responsibility blurred, authorship divided. Late afternoon light filled the room with quiet intensity. Closing arguments began. The prosecution focused on facts, money missing, decisions made, intent inferred through action. They insisted that identity debates distracted from measurable evidence. Responsibility remained with the person who controlled the system. The defense spoke differently. They did not deny complexity. They embraced it. "Identity is not a crime," the attorney said calmly. "Reinvention is not deception. And when multiple authors exist behind a narrative, assigning singular blame becomes dangerously simplistic." He paused. "This case is not about whether Daniel Hargrove existed before 12 years ago. It is about whether the evidence proves he engineered a crime, or whether he became the visible face of a system built long before him." The words settled deeply, because they shifted the question from identity to intention. The judge dismissed the court for deliberation. Hours passed. Outside, crowds gathered. Online debates intensified beyond anything seen earlier. Some viewers argued Daniel represented the danger of unchecked reinvention. Others believed he embodied the possibility of escape from past limitations. Two opposing identities formed around him, both fiercely defended. When the court reconvened, silence filled every corner. The verdict itself arrived without spectacle, measured, procedural, legal. But the emotional impact came from something else. The realization that no verdict could fully resolve what had been revealed, because the trial had exposed a truth larger than guilt or innocence. Identity is never singular. It is built through choices, relationships, and stories shared between people. Daniel stood as proceedings concluded. He turned toward the witness, the architect. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Years of shared history compressed into silence, not triumph, not defeat, understanding. Outside, cameras flashed endlessly, reporters shouted questions. But Daniel walked past them without answering. The architect followed at a distance, not leading, not guiding, just present, because the identity he had created no longer belonged to him. Long after the courthouse emptied, discussions continued. People argued, debated, chose sides. Some saw manipulation, others saw transformation. The story refused to settle into a single interpretation, and that was why it endured. Because the final revelation was never just about who built Daniel Hargrove. It was about a deeper question that lingered long after the trial ended. Are we defined by where we begin, or by the identities we choose to become?